Good morning, good afternoon, wherever it is that you are today. I'm Judy Samuelson with the Business and Society program at the Aspen Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our today's webinar, which is entitled How Business Can Close Racial Economic Gaps in 2021. This conversation is part of an ongoing series that we call The Next Move that we've been hosting throughout the 2021 COVID period as we explore the extraordinary impacts of this point in time and related events and the shifting public expectation of business leaders. Today's conversation focuses on the operational choices that companies can make to close racial economic gaps as expectations of business to address racial equity have risen, and of course the imperative to clarify the act ahead becomes more important. We know there's a need to drive change in big complex organizations, and today we'll be able to hear from some representatives of some organizations that fit that description. But when I got up this morning, I also needed to kind of process all of these messages and tributes that were coming in about these horrible killings in and around Atlanta. I caught this description from State Representative B. Nguyen, the first Vietnamese American to serve in the Georgia House, who called these shootings to be at the intersection of gender-based violence, misogyny, and xenophobia. However the perpetrator here is ultimately charged, we're called to step back and think about how do we connect the dots between the work that we do in the business sector and these horrific events that continue to poison and disrupt the conversation in myriad different ways. So it's kind of hard not to have a sense of despair about this, but we at the Business and Society program and all of us here today in this call and those who are participating and giving us their time and thoughts from the vantage point of important business institutions, all of us believe in the power of business and in business communities and in business institutions to elevate our intentions. Of course, this needs to be matched by the hard work of making sure we keep our promises, and to look at the manifestation of hate and racism in all of its guises. That work is unrelenting. And with that, I'd like to introduce our guest today and our superb moderator. Our guests are Elizabeth Morrison, who is the Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Officer at Levi Strauss, Stephen Mizell, the Chief Human Resources Officer and EVP at Merck, and Lata Reddy, the SVP of Inclusive Solutions at Prudential Financial and chair of the Prudential Foundation. Lata, welcome to you as well. And today's moderator will be Nicole Lindsay, Chief Operating Officer at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, who's also Chief Operating Officer for Sustainability at Mastercard. So we've got a crackerjack team here, and Nicole, I'm going to leave it in your hands.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judy. And greetings all. Thank you for joining us for our conversation. A little over a year ago, the way we live, work, and interact changed drastically. Since then, we've seen the heartbreak of COVID-19 unfold. We've had monumental election season and watched the world confront systemic racism in new ways. I would be remiss, like Judy, if I didn't give voice to the violence against people of Asian descent that we witnessed in Atlanta this week. This is a culmination of a year that has seen a 150% spike in anti-Asian hate. And while much of our conversation today is framed around the racial economic gaps facing Black and Latinx communities, we must hold space for all marginalized people. We must start with listening and learning, seeking to understand, introspection, but quickly we need to move to action. So what is our next move? That is the conversation for today. Within and through the corporate construct, how can leaders drive meaningful change toward racial equity and toward closing racial economic gaps? As we begin to recover from COVID-19, it's paramount that we use this moment to rebuild economies that work for everyone, to ensure that vulnerable and marginalized people have opportunities for dignified and secure work, a reliable safety net, and a path to prosperity. Left unattended, these challenges will become insurmountable barriers to building an inclusive and sustainable economy. So let's get to it. We have an esteemed panel. I'm excited to hear from each of them. So we know that systemic racism has been woven into the fabric of American society. And in 2020, we saw heightened awareness of this, frankly, an awakening with the killing of George Floyd for all of us to see. In response, each of your companies confronted racial inequality in bold and public ways. So can you each talk us through what that process was like? And we'll start with Lata.
Thanks, Nicole, and good afternoon. It's great to be here. So at Prudential, we were fortunate to have a base upon which to build, and we've been doing this work for some time, and a couple of years ago actually revamped our core DEI strategy to be all-encompassing and think about all aspects of our business. And so that's the foundation that we were working from. And yet and still, with the events of last year, we, like every other company, knew that we needed to look inward and really ask the hard questions, right? Were we doing as much as we could possibly do to address the issues and the big societal challenges? And so that was the beginning, right, of our process and our exploration. And so there were a few key components to that. And the framework in which we approached this was, and Nicole, you touched on a couple of these things, we took the posture of listening, understanding, committing, and then acting. And it was critical that we spent the right amount of time in each of those dimensions, because there's, the sort of tendency to rush to action and to make declarations about what you're going to do. But we knew that in this moment, if no other, right, it was important to really understand what we were trying to solve for. And that meant listening, and in particular, listening to our associates. So we structured a set of conversations across the company, had over 120 of these that were pretty raw and emotional. And they were for all of our employees, and people shared when they felt like they wanted to. And so there were a lot of experiences that were brought to the fore, and a lot of honesty and authenticity. And there were also a lot of ideas generated. And so those ideas were then sent to my team. And at the same time, I was standing up a racial equity task force that consisted of enterprise leaders at all levels and generations, because we wanted to make sure we had broad input. But wanted to make sure that we were covering off the needs of the entire company, our businesses, our functions, et cetera. And so we took in those ideas, processed them, went through everyone, shared them with our executive leadership team, engaged them in the conversation at the onset, and together arrived at what we call our 9 commitments to advance racial equity. And so once we did that, I would just add that other important pieces were, for Prudential, we're a legacy company. We're 145 years old and counting. And so we've ridden the waves of American history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So another thing we need to do is reckon with our past. And so we had a town hall, an all-employee town hall called Owning Our Past, where we brought in a historian who talked about, right, US history and how Prudential's history paralleled that, and really examined some of our own past practices that have contributed to the financial wealth gap, the racial wealth gap. And so then we knew it was important to just be very explicit about what we were trying to do internally and externally. So that was what was new for us, was going public with these commitments to hold ourselves accountable. And lastly, we continue to bring along our associates because we know that constant feedback loop and communication is critical to all of this work.
Great, thank you, Lata. Steve, I'll turn it to you with the same question about the process that Merck went through last year.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what Lata talked about. Some of the foundational work that we already did in DE&I continue to drive it. But I think the things that maybe I'd amplify is we really took some time to help give people forums to express anger and fear. And those were 2 things that I think helped us immensely, because there were a lot of people that were absolutely angry, but there were a bunch of people that were also very scared. And that translated into a lot of different needs that people had. So we had to go all the way from training for tools to how you talk about it, how you think about it. We had to also bring in support systems through EAP and just really provide vehicles so people could try to translate and digest what happened and then be able to communicate how they feel about it. And this wasn't just in the US, this is around the world. I mean, half my people are outside the US and people were really concerned about this. So that was kind of the first thing that we had to kind of think through. And just like Lata, we've been around for 126, 127 years. So there's some foundational things that were okay. The next thing that was really critical is that we just decided, and you have to understand the context a little bit. Ken Frazier has been a real outspoken, CEO about, kind of the state of the world, the state of the US, quite frankly, when you think about where we are. We're from a diversity and inclusion. So he was extremely vocal and he just continued to do that. And he got just as vocal inside of the company as he got outside. And I will tell you, it helps when you're close to retirement because you're at a point where you will, in fact, talk about this in a way that, quite frankly, had been really transparent and direct. And there was no mistaking where he came from on this issue. And given that I am not that far behind Ken in terms of state of career, and after living 6 miles from Ferguson when Michael Brown was killed, and quite frankly, having a little bit of kind of a practice run of how you address things like this, there were two things that I saw. First, you had to have individual leadership at the executive level. You have got to have leaders that are saying, I'm not just a spectator. I am going to take a position on this. And quite frankly, the position might be a little different than others. They didn't all have to be the same positions. Everybody was in a different place. That was the first thing. And then you have to bring that together as an executive team. So we spent time with some pretty raw discussions as an executive team on this subject. And we decided that there were a couple things that we were going to do. Obviously, support the organization, obviously, make statements, obviously make sure that we started to think about, employment representation a lot more aggressively, quite frankly, than we did. And then also make sure that we were going to make sure that with the communities that we were in, that we would get more engaged and think about how a company like us could work and help support those communities. So those are kind of the setups that I would just say that we went to, and we can talk about more of the detail later, but that's how we set it up, Nicole.
Steve, that's helpful. And you started to get into my next question a little bit about some of the learnings. And so we'll want to hear a little bit more about that. Elizabeth, over to you.
Yeah, so I feel like we are the titans of iconic companies because we're 160 plus years old as well. I think building on what both Lata and Steve said, we did a combination of both of those things. Listen to our employees, and also our CEO, Chip Berg, who I hope is nowhere near retirement, has traditionally been an outspoken advocate for human rights, for the human condition, and for democracy. He sent a note after the riot at the Capitol on January 6th, and really has been an outspoken leader in the space. And so it was a space we've naturally lived in, existed in. I think that what 2020 did for us, it was an awakening that we needed to focus on our insides matching our outsides. Our brand externally is one that's very inclusive. We've done ads around voting rights and different things, but when we look at our own representation, we really were not where we knew we needed to be. But our initial response was to really double down on some of the areas and some of the kind of structure that we had, starting with, again, what, as Lata said, listening. So really leveraging our employee resource groups, in particular, our Black resource group, Project Onyx, who helped create safe spaces for conversations shared with our leadership. We got much more vocal internally and externally through our CEO, but also through employees. We already, through the Levi Strauss Foundation, were focused on activism and philanthropy, but really doubling down in the social justice space. We had our first global women's conference and had over 1,000 employees of all identities attending, and just kind of kept this as a thread going through everything that we did. And of course, the commitment, we were transparent for the first time around our representation. So we were taking all of these steps to more authentically step into the space, and then finally culminating with the commitment to hire myself and really invest in a longer term strategy and a team. And also during the back half of last year, welcomed Elliot Rogers to our board. So our first African-American man, even though we have other diversity on the board. So really just moved into position to really make a full authentic commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll add that as kind of the final piece. When I came in, and it's been just about 100 days, in my assessment, I've looked at the organization and shifted us from what used to be called diversity, inclusion, and belonging to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because I think what 2020 taught us, number one, is that we weren't where we thought we were. Let's just be 100% real from a country perspective, from a world perspective. There was a lot of underlying issues, well, underlying for some people, not so underlying for others, that we needed to address, but that equity is where we need to focus, ensuring that our baseline, our systems, our policies, our practices are fair, and that we're being transparent about how they work. So that whole listening, and then really the assessment, and that's landed us now on a new diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy that I've literally just been sharing out the last few weeks, and getting huge, very warm welcome from the organization. And they're quite pleased to have an actual action plan to get us there.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for grounding us in this discussion. And Elizabeth, I think that's a great lead up to talking about some of the specific actions. And so, Steve, I'm going to start with you. The 110 initiative, it's garnered a lot of attention. And as I think most folks on the call are probably familiar, the commitment is to create 1 million family-sustaining jobs for Black Americans over the next 10 years. Can you tell us about the formation of that coalition and how it is approaching such an ambitious goal?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There were Ken Frazier, Ken Chenault, and several of their colleagues, Jenny Romanetti from IBM, came together and said, we have a real opportunity to make a difference. And we think that on the business community, we can really try to change some of the thinking as it relates to how we in fact think about talent. And if you think about the three things that were important, one, it was, look, let's try to look at how we can improve the current state of African Americans and their opportunities in corporate America. And they saw the answer to that is, let's focus on jobs. And it's kind of interesting, if you step back for a second, you'd say, when you think corporations and you think jobs, you usually think college degrees. When you think about family sustaining jobs. So their focus was on trying to address an important issue, which is African Americans that are typically from age 18 to 30, only 20% of them have degrees. So right there, you've got a big part of that population that were going to be excluded. So the focus was really on how do we begin to be more inclusive as we think about trying to provide jobs for African Americans. And there's a number of things we really started to focus on, and it was, how do you in fact begin to change some of the criteria that sometimes have over time become just standards that really weren't in fact required, like having a bachelor's degree for certain roles. So really focused on skills was a big part of that. But the whole notion came from, how can we make a difference, something that we control as businesses, and then how do we build a system to help facilitate that? And the build out of that system is monumental. And we look at this as a startup, but if you really put it in a nutshell, it's, you've got a talent pool that's being underutilized. You have companies that are in typically wars for talent, looking for talent. And then you have an ecosystem, whether it's college and universities at the, call it at the community levels, or NGOs that typically look for training and development. You've got this ecosystem that has tried to do that, but not at this scale. So it was, let's put a new organization together that can in fact marry the opportunities, marry the skill and the talent pools that are being underutilized, and then help build that ecosystem. So this was an ambition that this group had, and they decided to do something about it, put some economics behind it. We've been fortunate. We've been able to have some great companies join, and many of you are probably in the audience, and we're just getting started, but really, really excited about the opportunity to make a difference and really be specific about something. So this is creating jobs, and that's kind of how the foundation happened.
Awesome. Yeah, it's the specificity, the very clear aim, and getting incredible buy-in from other companies who are stepping up and making public commitments and commitments for hiring. Elizabeth, do you want to share what Levi Strauss is doing around creating more jobs?
Absolutely. So we are actually rich in diversity within our organization on our retail level, both our broader retail population and our retail leadership. So we have a real opportunity to better disperse that diversity throughout the organization. It's heavily Black and Latinx. So creating a pipeline program with employees that already kind of know and love our brand and our culture is a tremendous opportunity for us. We're also building a new university and diversity talent acquisition program, anchoring that in talent partnerships with external organizations, but also revamping our talent brand. Again, our product brands are so fantastic, Levi's and Dockers. We have an opportunity to bring real energy from those brands into our talent brand. Again, both leveraging the talent that we have and attracting new talent, as well as talent development programs. So looking at our BIPOC population. So for those that are unfamiliar, Black, Indigenous, people of color, people say either BIPOC or BIPOC. Just so that we all know what I'm saying, and looking at what are the unique challenges that those employees face and how can we build talent development programs that will help support them. And at the same time, how are we really zeroing in on their managers so their managers are aware of those unique challenges, and we're building that manager competency and capability so that they can be coaches as well as managers and mentors. So those are a few of the things that we're doing around job creation. And of course, as we move people up from our own ranks on retail into corporate, we create new opportunities also in retail. And then obviously there will always be hiring and more opportunities in corporate. So those are some of the ways.
Great, thank you. So Lata, it was interesting to hear more and learn more about work that Prudential is doing to reduce bias in the process, right? So we've got, the 110 that's got this demand and supply, trying to bring that together. Elizabeth, I love that point around developing the talent brand and aligning that. But we know that a lot of companies get stuck of getting folks in the door because some biases that exist in the recruiting process. So can you talk about how Prudential is reducing bias in employment practices and leveraging technology as well?
Sure. So as I think Elizabeth said this, I'll echo what she said around, we were trying to make sure that our internal aspirations matched the work we were doing externally. And so for decades, we've been making great investments in things like for Scholus and General Assembly in Europe, and a lot of programs that are involved in 110 and doing a phenomenal job of training diverse talent. And some of it would come into Prudential, but otherwise would just be available to the world. And we knew as we looked within, again, we needed to do more with our own talent. So we wanted to look across our talent life cycle and interrogate each step of that process and understand where the data pointed to opportunities to further mitigate bias and take that out of the system. And so one of the areas where we saw opportunities around talent mobility. So we created a platform that is a personalized technology platform called the Skills Accelerator. And what you do, our employees will go in, they'll create a profile, and it's focused on skills. So as Steve was talking about, right, moving away from this focus on degrees, it is what are the capabilities you bring to the workplace and how can they best be leveraged? And so they will, right, that will become more clear. There's also an opportunity to further build skills so that you're future ready. And then there's a matching system, right, an algorithm that helps match those skills with roles that are available within Prudential so that our internal current talent gets priority for those sorts of things. There are also capabilities around learning pathways. So you can get badges, right, further your own development, again, continue to build skills and make sure that you're well positioned.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And I think both in Lata in what you talked about as well as 110, it's not just about bringing talent, new talent in, it's also about cultivating the talent that you have within your organizations so that they're able to advance and be successful. So kind of on that note of empowering workers and employees, Elizabeth, I was looking at Levi Strauss's public statement and the subheader, I loved it, right? Black people deserve better. I was like, yes, that. You don't even say anything else. So, in addition to kind of quality jobs that we've kind of started talking about, we know that, people belonging, though I know you're changing your title and the focus of your work, but people deserve to feel like they can be successful. And so can you talk to us about the importance of a person feeling like they're able to have impact, and how does belonging align with kind of moving to better empowerment and engagement of employees, to recognizing all of them for the assets that they bring to the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start by talking about that shift in language, because inclusion is an action and belonging is a feeling. So if you're doing inclusion right, your outcome is going to be belonging, which really is that sense of psychological safety and your awareness that you can strive to do your best. And if you miss the mark, you still belong. People make mistakes. It's like your family members. They might say or do the wrong thing. They're not out of the family. So creating, that sense literally of belonging is critical for employees. Again, inclusion is the action and access to power. Belonging is knowing that you can truly bring your authentic self, do your best work, make mistakes, recover, and go on. And so for us, we're looking to continue to focus on inclusion so we can get employees to belonging. But again, those levers around talent development, training, and career growth are really going to be critical for us. So building people's cultural competency, especially our managers. Our frontline managers are the key to all of this. I mean, of course, my CEO, our board, and we need commitment from the top, but it's those line managers that shape employees' experiences. It's those line managers that are doing the hiring. So they are the ones that are shaping, the demographics and the complexion of our workforce. So if they don't get it, and if they're not held accountable, and if they don't, understand, that's where I feel like in diversity, we call them the frozen middle, because they are doing so much and they're so busy doing their own jobs, sometimes doing the jobs of employees, or at least making sure their employees are doing the role. And then also we're asking them to be kind of mentors, coaches, and be aware of the different identities of their employees. It's a lot. So we need to be supporting them, investing in them, building their capabilities, but also holding them accountable in real and tangible ways. And that's something that as we go down the path of how are we building those competencies, the next step will be how are we holding them accountable for their actions and for building belonging.
Great, thank you. Lata or Steve, do you have thoughts to add?
Yeah, I think that concept of worker voice, right, is such a critical element of belonging. As Elizabeth said, the destination, right, that we're trying to get to is that sense of belonging. And we have found that our business resource groups and that platform is a powerful platform, right, to create employee voice, to give voice to the concerns and challenges of our diverse associates in particular. And so we've made lots of different strides in giving that voice a seat at the table. And so one example is we created an enterprise-wide inclusion council about 1.5 years ago that is chaired by our chairman and CEO. And it consists of our entire executive leadership team, myself, our chief talent officer, and the co-leads of our 8 business resource groups. And we meet quarterly, and we just met yesterday. And so we talked about the shootings in Atlanta. We talked about how that, right, is impacting our Asian American colleagues and other colleagues. And so it's, you know, an opportunity to be very topical and talk about what's top of mind in the moment, and also to plan for, right, things that we need to do, actions we need to continue to take to create that fully inclusive environment that we're trying to create.
I'm not sure I would add much, but I think there's another dimension to this that I think is going to be a real opportunity for a lot of companies. And for us, one of the things that we recognized was that we built systems in many cases to support the building of an inclusive environment, but those systems were measuring to a large degree activities, and they were encouraging activities. How much unbiased training did you do, and how many people showed up, and talk about diverse slates kind of broadly. That's a tool to try to, you know, increase representation. And as an executive team, we said, you know, one of the things that will help with people thinking and believing they can express themselves and bring their full selves to work and feel comfortable about that is to see an environment that was diverse, to actually see an environment, top of the organization, including the board, that was diverse. And we went very specifically to, look, I have a terrific chief diversity officer who's doing some great foundational work with EBRGs and, you know, community outreach, but what can your executive team really do? What Ken and I spent some time talking about is, why don't we just focus our executive team on building vice presidents and making African-American and Hispanic vice presidents, because that's happened to be the area where we had some significant deficiencies when we did the disaggregation of data. So most of us talk about people of color and you kind of pull everything together and it looks okay. We disaggregated it. We said, no, let's get really focused on the dimensions of diversity and the different groups specifically. And we found out we had some real shortfalls in spite of a company that has an African-American CEO, CHRO, chief commercial officer, and lead director, all African. In spite of that, we had some real challenges. So we said, you know what, let's set some representation goals over the next 36 months. And then we get into this big debate that everybody, okay, how do you drive accountability? And we thought, oh yeah, let's put it in our LTI plan, or let's put it in an annual performance plan. And then you get in conversation with your attorneys and it gets really tricky in the environment we're in. So we said, you know what, we're just going to do it. So what we do is every 60 days, we have a meeting to specifically talk about progress that each of the members of the executive team is making. There's no excuses. It's every 60 days. They sit down, we take an hour and a half, and you explain what you've done, what you're doing, and what you're gonna do. And we had an aspiration, 36 months. I will tell you, we've been doing this for about 7 months, and we're halfway there already. We had, and I'll just share this candidly, we had just a handful, when I think about African-American females, we had one African-American vice president female in the company. Now we have 6. And we did that with people inside the company. We did that hiring externally, but it was really a matter of just saying, this is what we are gonna do. And I believe we do the same thing. We talk about building sales plans. I don't say I'm going to build an activity sales plan and count the sales I almost got, or I'm going to count the profit I almost made and how many customers. So I do think that that has a lot to do with really getting behind this and saying, you know what, we can do this if we have the commitment of an executive team and we hold them accountable. So we haven't done anything. We didn't change our incentive plan. And when I look down in the organization, my slates are so much more diverse because I know that the cascading and use what you have. So, you know, if you got a hierarchy, you could say, wow, we don't want to be hierarchical. Well, you know what? Being hierarchical in our case, that happened, that helped. And you just have to really think about how you can make traction. So for us, it was, how do we actually create a place where people can look and say, you know what? I see examples of myself. I see examples of where I want to be at the most senior levels, and I feel comfortable. So that was what we decided to do as a senior team, just that little area, and we're starting to see some pretty good traction.
What a great tangible example of not just the work, but the accountability and feedback loop that I know in preparing for this this session, audience members were able to send questions, and accountability came up, right? How do we hold ourselves, but also our organizations accountable? So Lata, I saw something around financial wellness of workers. So, you know, can you just share more about what that is and why that is important to Prudential?
Yeah, so, you know, there's a lot of research that shows that, well, first of all, let's just talk about, right, the financial stresses that American workers have been under for decades, right? And so pre the pandemic, Americans were struggling to pay bills and we're living paycheck to paycheck. And so the pandemic, as we know, exacerbated that, and certainly for Black and brown communities. And so, you know, we've also known that the research shows that people who are having financial stressors, right, carry that into the workplace. That seems obvious, but that definitely has an impact, right, on engagement and productivity. And so there's both the moral imperative and a business imperative to address the financial needs of our employees. And if you're talking about how businesses can help address the racial wealth gap and economic gaps, right, I mean, this is one prime example because it's our own workforce. And so we, right, have full control and can do whatever needs to be done. And so, you know, we define financial wellness by the ability to manage your day-to-day finances, to plan, right, and to save, and to protect against risk, and so unexpected, right, expenses. And we have been surveying our employees for many years. We do an annual survey as part of our health benefits plan. And we also, for our full total rewards package, right, have been surveying our employees to understand what the specific needs are by different cuts of our employee base, by age, by demographics, right, by tenure. And so in that way, we can then better tailor our offerings so that they meet the specific needs of our workforce. And again, we know that the end result of that will be more engaged employees, more productive employees, more, you know, higher rates of customer satisfaction, and so on. So multiple reasons for businesses to take this head on.
Great. Sorry, Elizabeth, did you have something? I saw you out of the corner of my eye.
Oh, no.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
So Lata, thank you for talking about that and kind of reminding us that workers and employees are people. When we're thinking about closing the racial economic gaps that exist, we have to think holistically about our different stakeholders. So I want to remind audience members to submit questions if they have them. We have folks who are passing those along to us, and we will both have a formal Q&A, but try to incorporate them. So before we go to the questions from audience members, I want to talk about specifically the role of corporations in leveling the playing field, in achieving or at least striving for greater equity. We know that the choices that companies make for their customers, for their stakeholders, for communities, play a big role in widening or reducing economic, the racial wealth gap. The private sector, a lot of the thinking before was about philanthropy and what can we, do as charity or kind of on the side of our desk. And now companies are beginning to think more about how this relates to core operations, how they use all of their assets in partnerships to advance this work. And so I would love to kick it to all of you to talk about how your companies are thinking about leveraging their assets and core operations to close the racial wealth gap. And maybe I'll start with Lata. I think given Mastercard, I'm a little bit more familiar with the work that Prudential is doing. So would love to hear more about your work.
Sure. So about 8 years ago, we shifted the platform that I actively manage to address just this issue, right? How can we be the tip of the spear in helping Prudential as a massive, right, corporation with almost 50,000 employees around the world, help embed inclusion across everything that we do? And so we certainly think about bringing all of our competencies to bear. And that, our philanthropy is part of that. We do impact investing. We've got the time and talent of our executives and our employees for sure, important parts of that. But we're one of the largest asset managers in the world. We have retirement services, right, and insurance offerings. So how does all of that come into play? And it's kind of shifting the mindset from a transactional mindset of here's an organization we can fund, or here's, right, somebody we can do something with, to what are the problems we're trying to solve? In our case, it's around financial challenges. And then, who are the best in class actors, right? Who are the people who are doing interesting things? Who are the people who are closest to the ground in the communities we're trying to serve? And then how do we best support them? Thinking about that entire toolkit. And so just by way of example, right, whether it's public policy, we all have government affairs arms or that sort of thing. So, we've been actively advocating for paid family leave, as it's something that we know will dramatically, right, positively impact Black and brown families in particular. We have been looking at new distribution platforms and partnering with our businesses on that. So we have a partner called D-Free who works on, particularly in the Black community, but it's broader than that, right, on helping deal with debt and intergenerational debt transfer, right? And so, and the entry point is the Black church. So leveraging, right, that trusted institution to go into communities with financial offerings, right, solutions, products that best meet the needs. And then lastly, around up to and including product development. So partnering with our business colleagues, and one example is with our retirement business on an emergency savings vehicle that's part of our in-plan 401k offering for our clients, right, our workplace-based clients, so they can offer their employees this vehicle to save for those, unintended or unexpected expenses, rather than withdrawing from their retirement plan. And we know how negatively, right, that compounds over time. So
Great.
Those are just some examples of how, businesses can be thinking about this.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I would also build on that. I feel as though we're kind of taking a multifaceted approach as well, from our philanthropy through the Levi Strauss Foundation, but also areas of focus driven by corporate, our sustainability focus, and even within that, doubling down on environmental justice, something that impacts Black and brown communities disproportionately. As a global values-based employer, having wellness initiatives and thinking about our employees and their lives, so their holistic wellness, both how do they balance the demands of work, but also home. Over 2020, we implemented a few things: meeting-free Fridays, shorter meeting times, corporate day off, which is the last day of the month off, and really launched Seamless, our wellness initiative, across the enterprise for care and support of employees. Also just, again, doubling down in the kind of social activism space and lifting Black influencers and their voices. So helping give back to the community in that way, and really leveraging our brand as I like that Lata said, the tip of the spear in that space, to really set the example of what inclusive partnerships look like, and how are we driving and telling stories through our brand. So, for Black History Month, or right before Black History Month, we launched The Beauty of Becoming, which is a brand campaign from our Levi's organization, which celebrates Black activists, Black stories, and their causes. Through Dockers, we launched a campaign called Recognize. Both of those are we're running for a full year. And so we'll provide ongoing opportunities for storytelling, attention to those folks and their causes, investment in their causes. And so giving back in all of those ways and supporting our employees holistically through wellness are some of the ways in which we're doing that as well.
Great.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add, I think just like Lata and Elizabeth, I mean, there's a lot of things that we're doing to provide, I think, support to our communities. But I think there's a specific opportunity that I mentioned that I think all of us have is one of the things that we know we are wrestling with, and I think about the US for a second, is there's a health gap. There's a health equity gap. If you think about maternal death and pregnancy, it's 2 to 3 times the level for African Americans and people with Asian, Indian descent or Hispanic descent, much higher than there are for white. So a huge gap there on health, and that extends into broader health consideration. And then there's obviously a wealth gap that we all know about. And if you close that wealth gap as a country, our GDP will go up significantly. And there's been a lot of studies about that. So one area that we spend a lot of time on, and we're just, I want to say a lot of time, we've done it historically, but we're really fine tuning it now in this environment, is supplier diversity and thinking about how you drive economic inclusion. I spend $10 to $12 billion a year with outside companies. A lot of them are large major companies, but also a lot of them are small companies. And last year, we spent $2.5 billion with small minority suppliers. And one of the things that I did in a previous life was really start to figure out how you can, in fact, begin to mentor, develop, and build a network of small disadvantaged companies that become medium and large companies by providing very specific engagements with them that are beyond just give me the lowest price and I will give you the bid. It really is, how do we partner? How do they become extensions of us? And that helps in branding, helps in a lot of issues. So we've really started to focus on that area and have put some real resources behind building a network of companies that we adopt at very early stages. So very small shops all the way to mid-sized companies that need to grow. And we give mentorships through our senior executives here at Merck to actually go inside of those companies. And again, at previous lives, I spent a bunch of time figuring out how you drive that, because there's a multiplier effect. Many of those companies that are owned by minorities, and say African Americans as an example, they have a multiplier impact of taking care of multiple members of families, members of communities, creating jobs. And that, I think, is going to be a huge opportunity for us to really get serious about how we, in fact, require that our procurement functions build those relationships in a much broader and deeper way. So that's something we've been focused on, and some progress, but I think there's I think there's a big gap between what we're doing and what we can do. And I think it goes directly to being able to close a bit of that wealth gap that we have.
I agree. And I think I would just add, I mean, there's the opportunity gap it can close too. So if you think about, so even in professional services, right? And whether it's asset management or the legal profession and the opportunity set that we as companies have, because as you know, Steve, right? Companies have traditionally thought about it from sort of janitorial services or cafeteria, right? So important things, and we'll continue to do that, but there's also an opportunity to think about it more broadly and in ways you were describing, right? The investments we make in small and medium enterprises externally as well.
So you each have shared work that you're doing, and I think one of the questions we got, I think it speaks to that each of you have authenticity. Your companies have some authenticity in showing up at this with this work, and that's not a given. So for those companies that are still grappling with how to approach this, what advice would you give to leaders to show up and do this work in a way that is authentic?
Yeah, I honestly have been getting this question a lot. People want to know, even inside excuse me, the company, what they can do and how they can show up meaningfully. You really do have to go on a personal journey with this. As you take in the news, as you listen to your strategy, as you learn about the actions that your organization is taking, you need to be a little still with yourself and see, where do you have energy? Where do you have a strong reaction to something that your organization, like if we're talking about talent acquisition or mentoring, does something, do you get that tingle, that feeling? If we're talking about supplier diversity, thank you for flagging that, Stephen. Is that something that you're really interested in? What does your own network look like? Now that we've all been held hostage by COVID, our social connections are stronger than ever. LinkedIn is a place where you can reach out to people you don't know, to connect with them and build up your network. Listen, we've all made commitments about increasing the diversity of our workforce. How can you help in that? Can you be an ambassador of your brand or your workplace and your culture, and help to start spreading the word amongst your communities or joining other communities? So I think that finding an intuitive place where you connect with DEI, kind of what's your DEI story or where's your DEI energy, is really the place where folks need to start.
Great.
Nicole, I mean, I think you
Yes.
said it, you talked about showing up, or I think you used that phrase, right? How do you, and that's a big part of it, right? Is showing up and being an ally. And as Elizabeth said, right, it is doing the work and going inside first to understand kind of where you are and situate yourself in your level of understanding and awareness, and right, going on that journey. But then and being authentic, and you're not going to have all the answers, and you're going to make mistakes, and we've got to show each other grace as well. But it's right, it's just getting engaged.
And the thing that I would add, it's an interesting question, because there's one way to think about that question. You could say, what do I need to do as an individual so I can show up? I think, as both Elizabeth and Lata pointed out. And then the other one is a bit more challenging when you say, I'm in a company, I am not a CEO, I am not even on the executive team, I'm not even a director, but I think we could do more, and I don't see that happening in my company. That's where I think a lot of people are, and trying to figure out, okay, how can I help my company get better in this? And it gets really interesting, because if you have something like EBRGs, these employee business resource groups, I think there's much more leverage in those groups than I think we've used in the past. And I think being able to pose some of those questions to your executive teams in a constructive way through the power of those networks. And I've encouraged my networks to not just work in their own silo, but think about how we can work across. And then you can bring some of those issues constructively to your leadership teams. And it's hard to ignore that. I mean, it's just hard to ignore that when you ask that in a constructive way on how we can get better, how we can help energize ourselves or get really laser focused on this, I think is a vehicle. So that's something that perhaps our colleagues can use as an approach. But I do think that when you think about most people, because at Fortune 500, there's only 500 CEOs, there's only 5,000 executives when you think about the top of the organization, and then you've got hundreds of millions of employees. So it's really, how do you get to that group? Because once a CEO says, this counts, this matters, I will tell you, that's when you'll make traction. That's when it will happen. So I just think we've got to look at it both ways. How do we go here when we need to, and then how do we push it up from the bottom as well?
Well, the good news is the pressure is coming from the outside as well, right? So
Yeah,
companies that haven't yet been paying attention and doing what they need to do, all right, in for a world of pain. I mean, investors, right? Everybody's asking the questions now. So there's
right.
now the outside in.
You're exactly right, Lata. This is a moment. We do have a moment. And like I said, I live 6 miles from Ferguson when that happened. We made a little bit of traction, but we looked up and a lot of people went back to their normal ways of operating in many respects. And this is one that, just personally, I said, I'm not going to lose the opportunity to make a difference. And I'm sure Elizabeth and Lana feel the same way, that let's take advantage of this. And there's a lot of things that are opening up this environment. And it's very hard to make the business case for homogeneity right now.
Right. And this relates to another question that we got from the audience around achieving impact and quality interventions and balancing that with this urgency and this push for speed and frankly visibility, right, that companies also want to show. And so how do you manage, having the impact you want while moving at a pace that for some feels like it might be too fast?
Yeah, as I've been presenting my strategy, I embedded a DEI maturity model so that there was a baseline of understanding of the phases that the organization will need to go through. Of course, my executive team asked me how long did I think it was going to take us? And I said, I think we could get halfway there in 5 years. If we do all the things that we're supposed to do and we make all the investments we need to make, and we hold ourselves and the organization accountable. Because it's very much like a recipe, and you have to figure out what recipe is it that is for your organization. But I think there's a focus right now and a challenge of DEI practitioners to capitalize on the momentum and the excitement. Absolutely, 2020 was devastating, but it also was a huge catalyst for many of our organizations and for our industry. So we want to capture that, but we also need to move at what will be an integrative and sustainable pace of change. This is an exercise in change management, from individual behaviors to organization systems, policies, practices, etc. So what are the things we can do that are the quick wins and can be highly visible? What are the things that are going to take longer and that are going to require more investment? Like I've talked very much about organizational readiness as an organization who is 160 years old, but only established a workforce focused diversity team in 2018. We're in our infancy on the journey. From a marketing brand perspective, we are much more mature, but from a workforce focus and supplier diversity, we don't have a supplier diversity program right now. So that's something we're working. So I'm being very transparent with what the journey is going to take and setting those expectations with real clarity and saying, when everybody raises their hand and says, what can I do? The other thing is I've embedded key enablers throughout my presentation so folks understand there's not a team of 6 that's going to drive this. It's not even going to be the whole just HR group. It's going to take the C-suite. It's going to take the HR team. It's going to take my team and the other COEs, and it's going to take every employee. To Steve's point, whether that's attending an ERG event, broadening your your network, or educating yourself around bias so you're a better manager and a better team member, or being the person that takes the time out to welcome the new team member and give them the inside scoop on how the team works. There's work for all of us, and unless we all lean in, we're really not going to get there. It's going to take collective impact.
Yeah, Elizabeth, the only thing I'd add, I think you're spot on. The thing I would add is that we have to remember that progress in this area is good for everybody in the company. This is not, saying, hey, look, we're going to do this at the expense of other people. This is how do we get the best, and how do we, in fact, close those gaps with every employee in the company, because we'll get much better performance. And for most of us, everybody's on an incentive plan where all your employees participate. So if we are a high performing company and everybody is able to do, everybody benefits. So this is not a zero sum. I'm going to take care of this group at the expense. And sometimes you have to get very laser focused on the area you're trying to improve in, but it's not at the expense of others. And that we'll have to figure out how to have that communication, because we could have a whole separate conversation on how people might feel that they're being excluded as we focus on making progress here. And I think that's a really important part of how you think about making progress overall.
I just want to add a quick note there, because I have been very intentional on talking about our original focus. Our initial focus is on Black, Latinx, and women talent, because that's where we have our greatest deficits. But that the talent practices that we are evolving to, the inclusive talent practices, will benefit all employees. The retention strategy and framework I'm building for our BIPOC talent ultimately will be used for all top talent. So we're going where our greatest need is, but ultimately, as you said, this is a win for all of us. And my CEO rightly called that out as I was talking about kind of the outcomes of DEI. He said, these just aren't things we need to focus on for diversity. This is what's going to make our business better and more competitive.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. I feel like I know we could go on for another hour, but we're close to time. And so we'll close. So, making the economy work for everyone everywhere starts with these types of conversations where we bring together cross-sector leaders to discuss the issues, help us begin to think about how we define the choices and actions that we need to make to move forward, and to form partnerships and collaborations to have meaningful impacts for people and communities. I want to thank our incredible panelists for such a thoughtful and inspiring and yet tactical conversation. And thank you to the Aspen Institute for hosting us. And finally, thank you to our audience and to all of you for joining us today. Hopefully you're more focused and motivated to create and lead positive change in your workplace places and in the world. Be well.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.